Hello and welcome to this episode of Inside Israel. I'm Mariam Azacher. In Zionist Israel, not all Jews are equal. There's a specific ideology that dominates the entity. It's that of Ashkenazi Jews who are white European settlers. As a result, Jews with a North African or West Asian background have had to give up certain principles and ways of life in order to be accepted by the dominant Ashkenazi Jews. Ever since the inception of Israel into the region in 1948, there has been a call for Jews to immigrate to Israel and populate the entity, and many Europeans have poured into the region, changing the face and culture of the land and taking power into their own hands. And today, the Mizrahi Jews continue to feel undermined by these white European settlers of Ashkenazi background.
Jews that are originally from Western Asia and Northern Africa are known as Mizrahi Jews. The newly-incepted Israel in 1948 managed to import them through various means, including incitement against them at their own communities and promises of wealth and a new home in Israel. This took place from 1948 through 1967. Tel Aviv did this in a bid to justify its Zionist presence on occupied Palestinian lands. While the Zionist regime promised the Mizrahi Jews a new home in Israel, they were surprised to learn that this was not the case. The new Mizrahi settlers expected to end up in occupied Jerusalem al-Quds or Tel Aviv, to live in the holy city or by the beach, as was promised by regime and military authorities. Instead, they were sent to the Negev desert in southern Palestine. When they refused to settle there, Israeli leaders used violence and deceit to force them. They were also used via spying recruitments against their home countries if they wanted better living standards in Israel. The Mizrahi settlers often tried to resist. They refused to comply and spoke out against their unfair treatment. But the Israeli regime did not hesitate to take severe measures against them. It manipulated them and threatened to take away their children. Israel's European settlers, who came before the Mizrahi settlers, made decisions that created social and economic inequalities that have lasted for generations. Among these decisions, they created a system of what is known as population dispersal in order to develop new towns and increase the population. Authorities instructed the drivers of trucks carrying the new Arab Jewish settlers to literally throw them out of their trucks and onto the ground and leave them behind against their will. In a bid to keep the Arab Jews far from the cultural, political, and economic centers of the newly incepted Israel between 1954 and 1956, Israel built dozens of development towns in the northern and southern geographic peripheries, far from those very economic, political, and cultural centers.
Now, why do Mizrahi Jews continue to be polarized in Israeli society? Why did Israel initially aim to take away their identity? What is population dispersal? How did population dispersal divide Mizrahi families? This next case study from Israel will answer these questions and more.
I think, first of all, the Israeli society is polarized in general. It's not specific to Mizrahi Jews. It's something which is quite common in the entire society in Israel. The Zionist movement was a European movement. It was secular. It was inspired by the national movements in Europe in the 19th century. And their vision was to create a new Jew. In the world until the 1900, most of the people were religious. But back then, the Enlightenment, etc., people started to become more secular. And the Jewish movement was also secular. It wanted to create a new Jew who is not religious, who is secular, who's, a chalutz, who's like a pioneer that builds the country and deals with agriculture and stuff like that. And this vision of the new Jew, the Sabra, they tried to force anyone to get to this. That was the ideal. They wanted everyone to be like this ideal. They created this approach called the melting pot. They said, we're bringing Jews from everywhere in the world, we'll put them here and we'll make all of them the same. they made them feel like ashamed in their religion, in their traditions from home, in being religious. You know, for example, the Jews from Yemen that arrived later in 1948 and 1950, the Zionists here, I don't know, some will say aggressively encourage them, and some will say force them to cut their paths, you know, the religious paths they have. Because they didn't want them, they want anyone, they want to create a brand new Jew, to erase thousands of years of history and create something brand new. For Jews that arrived from Arab countries, it was a shame to be Arab, you know, to have their Arab heritage was suddenly, it became, not suddenly, it was similar to the culture of the enemy. So it made them feel ashamed for their culture. It made them avoid speaking Arabic. For example, Mizrahi Jews nowadays, the younger generation, they no longer speak Arabic. It made them feel ashamed in their music, in their culture, in their, you know, primitive habits. I can tell you that there were many various events of injustice by the government towards Mizrahi Jews. Many types of injustices. For example, in housing, okay? Jewish people that arrived after 1948, in the early 50s, from North Africa, for example, or other Muslim countries, were sent to live in the desert. You know, they thought, okay, we're coming to Israel, we want to, you know, we're longing to Zion, we want to go to Jerusalem, or at least we want to go and live by the beach, you know, but the country forced them to live in deserted areas, what we call developmental towns. Others that were habitat in the center were put in townships, in refugee camps for years. You know, and it's something that was specifically to Mizrahi Jews. Even if, you know, if a group of Jews came from Tunisia, for example, and from Poland at the same time, so the country will take both groups and put them in a kind of a refugee camp. But a few months later, the country will, you know, the clerks and the government, etc., they will make sure that the people, the Jews that came from Poland, will move to normal houses, you know, to a real neighborhood with a house and not just a kind of a tent. But for the Jews from Tunisia, for example, they could leave them there for years. It is known that back then in the 50s, one baby out of 8 Yemenite, like in one family out of 8 families, Yemenite families, Jewish Yemenite families, a baby was just, you know, disappeared. You know, it was said to be dead, but there was no body. You know, went to be hospitalized and somehow didn't come back home, and they didn't allow the parents to see a body or something like that. So there was a lot of injustice from the government toward Mizrahi Jews, and the government of Israel hasn't taken any responsibility for that, or didn't, you know, recognize the injustice up until today.
Mizrahi Jewish activist and fellow at Harvard Divinity School, Tom Mehager, joins us from the Israeli capital, Tel Aviv, via Skype. Welcome to the show, Mr. Mehager. Now, you are a Mizrahi Jew yourself. So what can you tell us about the living conditions of Mizrahi Jews in Israel?
For me, as a Mizrahi Jew, it represents, unfortunately, the tragedy in which people came to this place not in order to be a Mizrahi or Ashkenazi, just to be a citizen, just to be part of a community. But unfortunately, the whole treatment, the whole policy was racist. The communities were sent and they're segregated. comparing to other communities. Schools were segregated. Again, different paths to Mizrahi Jews comparing to Ashkenazi Jews. So it's simply a tragedy that instead of having a solid society in a solidarity way, we have a society that kind of segregated.
Well, how has this type of polarization impacted the Israeli society in general?
Well, I think that this is an historical repression. Like, I can tell that all the communities, the Mizrahi communities that came during the early 50s to Israel, and even before that, the Yemenite and Sephardic communities that was in Palestine before the establishment of Israel, I think they all been repressed in a way that is crucial to understand the whole history of the Israeli society as well as the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. It has an effect on our all society, gaps, voting patterns, etc.
Now, can you tell us about the types of policies that Mizrahi Jews were targeted with when they arrived in Israel?
Well, it is very clear that it was a racist policy against the Mizrahi communities that came and were sent to the remote places. We have protocols, and the protocols actually proves that the institution wants the Ashkenazi migrants to live in the center of Israel and by the coast, and the Mizrahi Jews to live far away, remote places, developed townships, etc. So that made gaps, social economical gaps that we can tell up until today. It's very clear. So yeah, the consequences of this policy is very severe.
Now, can you give us some recent examples of the segregation policies you talked about?
Well, this is very clear that they had the state authorities and the Ashkenazi elite. They had racist assumptions towards Mizrahi Jews. We have quotes from, let's say, the Israeli Ministry of Education, Zalman Aran, that said that Mizrahi Jews should study separately, like the Mizrahi youth should study separately from Ashkenazi youth. There should be a segregation. We have a lot of quotes, let's say, from the David Ben-Gurion, the first Prime Minister of Israel, that said that those communities are a threat.
Thank you for that, Mr. Mehager. That was Mizrahi Jewish activist and fellow at Harvard Divinity School, Tom Mehager from Tel Aviv. Now stay right where you are, because we're going to be right back after a short break.
יש לפעמים אנשים מיוחדים שהם רוצים משהו להשיג, אז הם אומרים שיש קיפוח, שיש, אבל טוב.
מה דעתי על זה? יש להם הרגשה שהם מופלים לרעה. עד כמה זה נכון אני לא יודעת, כי כשאת מסתובבת ברמלה, ביפו, בעכו, איפה שיש ערבים, את רואה שהם חיים די טוב. יש להם בתים יפים, יש להם מכוניות, יש להם עסקים משגשגים.
אנחנו מדברים על מזרחים.
אני חושב שהחברה קיבלה את היהודים המזרחים. כן, גם אני באופן אישי, גם חלק מהם.
מה שלא, זה כולם יהודים, לא?
כן. איך את רואה?
אני לפי דעתי גם אמרתי, גם השכנים הבני דודים שלנו, גם כן טובים.
יפה מאוד, יפה.
אני חושב שזה המקום הכי טוב בשבילם. המדינה דואגת להם, הם דואגים למדינה, וזהו, נהנים פה.
After 2 failed elections, Israelis recently voted in a 3rd election. And more than 20,000 Mizrahi Jews voted for Arab lawmakers of Palestinian origin who were native to the land. These candidates were mostly Christian and Muslim. Now, why did this happen? Find out in this next report.
In the recent and latest Israeli elections after 2 failed ones, more than 20,000 Mizrahis voted for Arab lawmakers of Palestinian origin, who are mostly Muslims and Christians. Why? Simply put, they do not trust the dominant Ashkenazi regime that has taken them away from their homes in deceitful ways that continue to impact and shape their lives and the lives of their children to this day. It also reflects the polarity facing Israeli society. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu made clear that Israelis voting for Arab parties is an act of extremism. Netanyahu, of course, represents the head of the hierarchical pyramid. He himself is an Ashkenazi Jew from Eastern Europe. The rest of the social and political hierarchy includes Sephardic, Mizrahi, Ethiopian or Black Jews, and finally Arab Israelis, the actual indigenous people of the land known as Palestine. Many of the Jewish Arabs who left their homes for Israel have for generations learned that the white European dominant society was not accepting of their Arab Jewish children. The Mizrahis are challenged, marginalized, and vilified again and again by Ashkenazi or European Jews. In Israel, Mizrahi Jews are still underrepresented. They comprise less than 9% of Israel's academic faculty members. This is despite the fact that over 50% of Israeli Jews are of Mizrahi or Sephardic origin. There has never been a Mizrahi Israeli theater director, never a Mizrahi head of public broadcasting, never a Mizrahi state attorney, and never a Mizrahi prime minister. They still face discrimination, whether Israeli society wants to admit it or not. Since the beginning, many of Israel's Mizrahi Jews were native speakers of Arabic, which is considered by Tel Aviv the language of Israel's enemies. In Israel, nobody wanted Arab culture. To this day, they are frowned upon by much of society.
Anthropologist, author, lecturer, and political activist Jeff Halper joins us from Israel via Skype. Thank you for joining us, Mr. Halper. Now, here's my first question for you. Why do you think that so many Mizrahi Jews voted for Arab Muslim, Druze, or Christian leaders?
Yeah, Israeli society has been hard on Mizrahi Jews in the sense that that they came from the wider Muslim world. And, the Muslim world, for Zionists coming from Europe, were the enemies. I mean, they were enemies politically, the Muslim world. They were the enemies culturally, let's say. There was a lot of prejudice against, the clash of civilizations idea that we're advanced in the Europe and they were primitive and all of that stuff. And to the degree that they were associated with the Arab world, yes, Israel was very hard on them. And then it was doubly hard on them because it made them give up their culture. Their culture was seen as not relevant or not even legitimate. You can't be an Arab Jew. You can be a Mizrahi Jew maybe. And then we used to talk about Eidot, about communities. We used to talk separately about Yemenite Jews, Moroccan Jews, Syrian Jews, and so on. Now, Mizrahi is a wider combination. But yes, so that today, the young generation of Mizrahi Jews don't know Arabic or don't know the different languages of the East that they came from. They don't know their history. They don't know their music, and they certainly would not accept the idea that they're Arab Jews, which they really are. So essentially they've been left, and that's where you see Shas coming in, this right-wing Mizrahi religious party that copies the Ashkenazi. They're ultra-Orthodox, dress all in black, and they go to yeshivas. They become a Mizrahi, ultra-Orthodox, Jewish, European type of community. So it shows the distortions and the alienations that happened because they weren't allowed to really integrate into the country in terms of who they really were.
Well, see, the Israeli media was quick to label those Mizrahi Jews who voted for Arab politicians as extremists. Now, what do you make of that?
Well, Israeli politicians would call anybody who votes for the Joint Arab List an extremist. And the whole idea that a Jew, an Israeli Jew, would somehow support the Arab List, you're identifying with the enemy, basically. I mean, even though they're Israeli citizens and they're a part of the political system, Israeli Jews, especially right-wing Israeli Jews, like in the Likud and the religious parties, see them as a fifth column. Don't see them as really Israelis. To be really an Israeli, they have to be Jewish, of course. So, so in a sense, anybody that breaks that bond of the family, of the ethnic group, you know, that Israeli Jewish, and you vote for the enemy, an Arab, is of course considered an extremist. Now, not many Mizrahi Jews do that.
Well, thank you for that, Mr. Halper. That was anthropologist, author, lecturer, and political activist Jeff Halper from Israel. Now, another group known as the Sephardic Jewish community are those who descended from Jews living in Spain or Portugal. Activists like Moni Yakim, who himself is a Mizrahi Jew, believe that their treatment is identical to that of Mizrahi Jews and are considered the same in the eyes of the Israeli society.
The fact that the Sephardi people are eliminated from the political platforms creates harm not only to the Sephardi people but also to the community at all, because what we hear is politics that are Ashkenazis against Ashkenazis, and the Sephardi people are only used as voters to enhance the political attitudes of white men Zionism. We are trying to establish our own leadership, and it's a fate that will happen by connection with the Palestinian leadership in a mutual understanding and collaboration. In the last 70 years, the Jewish Sephardi community arrived to a situation of distrust of the political organizations, which are dominated by the Ashkenazi white men. And lately, we start finding that the Palestinian community didn't fall in the same fate, and they are reorganizing themselves outside of the political Zionist Ashkenazi parties. So we see a big hope in collaboration with them and creating a joint political venture for the benefit of all the Arabs, Arab Jews, and Arab Muslims, and Arab Christians.
It's now time to look at news that is making press in Israel. The Times of Israel. A charity affiliated with a prominent and controversial ultra-Orthodox rabbi has been promising donors that those who pay $836 will enjoy immunity from the coronavirus, and so will their families. Haaretz. Following a protest against the Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, the Prime Minister's son Yair Netanyahu tweeted that he hopes the elderly people who die following this protest will be from the left-wing opposition camp. I-24 News. The Israeli military is irked by a video showing a meeting between the head of the Syrian armed forces and the Lebanese Hezbollah forces in the Golan Heights. Ynet. Thousands gather in the center of Tel Aviv to protest the current political deadlock under Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Israel Hayom. Israel and the Lebanese resistance movement Hezbollah are on a collision course. According to the report, Israel's working assumption needs to be that should they initiate an attack, Hezbollah will retaliate with more than firing a few missiles at Israeli military installations and vehicles. And that was the result of this week's investigation. Now we want to include every individual voice, so get on presstv.com and tell us about your very own experience. Until next time.